starting in Europe today. In Belarus yesterday, Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko spoke to a small group of foreign media. This was about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Lukashenko is a firm Russian ally and supporter of Mr. Putin. During the interview yesterday, he said if a single soldier enters Belarusian territory from Ukraine with weapons to kill his people, he would be ready to fight alongside the Russians. Military cooperation between Russia and Belarus has been increasing. But so far, Lukashenko has avoided sending his troops to Ukraine. In Ukraine, yesterday, the army said Russia fired 36 cruise missiles. The missiles fired from land and sea killed a woman and hit important infrastructure. Ukraine's military said most of the missiles were shot down. The Americas. In the United States, yesterday, there was a public meeting regarding a toxic chemical spill in Ohio. The people at the meeting were angered when the rail firm involved in the disaster didn't show up to the meeting. The representatives from the Norfolk Southern Railway Company didn't attend the meeting yesterday because they were concerned for their safety. 13 days ago, a train of theirs was derailed while carrying the chemicals, causing a huge fire. Since the disaster, thick black smoke has polluted the air. Thousands of fish have died. And people have told local media that their pets have fallen ill. However, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine has said that the water is still safe to drink.
The experts told us, they said, look, it's it would be a long shot if there's any problem with this water, because these are deep wells that feed people, that feed the municipal water supply there. But we said, look, we got to test them anyway. And so we did test them. We tested all 5 of the wells, and they all came back as good.
In Nicaragua, yesterday, a court stripped 94 people of their citizenship. These people were declared traitors to Nicaragua. They have all publicly criticized Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega, who is in his 4th consecutive term in office. This is the second group of government critics to have their citizenship revoked. Africa. In Mozambique, a pastor has died after trying to fast for 40 days. This was in an attempt to copy what Jesus Christ is said to have done in the Bible. Francisco Baraja, the founder of the Santa Trinidad Evangelical Church, died after 25 days of no food and water. He had lost weight to the point he could not stand up. In Gambia, yesterday, the trial of 4 military officers and a policeman took place. The 5 men were accused of plotting to overthrow the Gambian president. They were charged with 5 counts, including treason and inciting mutiny. Gambia also now has a worldwide red notice to arrest another suspect. A red notice is a request to law enforcement worldwide to find and arrest someone. Asia. In South Korea, capital city Seoul is removing women-only parking spaces. They were introduced 14 years ago after a rise in violent crimes in basement car parks. But city officials say such spaces aren't needed anymore and will be converted to family parking spots. Critics say the removal is just the latest example of anti-feminist policies in South Korea. In India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said India plans to become the third largest market in the aviation industry. Khadija Tahir reports.
Air India, India's largest international airline, has placed an order for 220 Boeing aircrafts and 250 Airbus passenger jets. The Boeing planes purchased from the American company is the third largest Boeing sale of all time and was called historic by United States President Joe Biden. Indian Prime Minister Modi has said that India aims to become the third largest market in the aviation sector.
And finally, in the United States, Tesla chief executive Elon Musk said he donated around $1.9 billion worth of shares to charity last year. In 2021, he donated around $5.7 billion worth of shares to charity. Mr. Musk has an estimated net worth of $197 billion. And that's your world news in 7 minutes. A big thank you to Luca in Slovakia for becoming our newest supporter. If you'd like to become a supporter and have access to the transcripts of every episode, go to send7.org. I'm Namitha Raghunath, and on Monday you will be with Stephen DeVincenzi.
Well, President Biden today was talking about these unidentified flying objects we've been shooting down.
We don't have any evidence that there has been a sudden increase in the number of objects in the sky. We're now just seeing more of them, partially because the steps we've taken to increase our radars, to narrow our radars.
The president ruled out an alien invasion or even further spying activity from China. And our Charles Feldman joins us with the possible source of one of those objects that was shot down over Alaska.
Yeah, and we're talking about perhaps something called a pico balloon. Tom Medlin is a retired FedEx engineer. He's co-host of the Amateur Radio Roundtable, and he's got 3 of these pico balloons going all around the Earth even as we speak. Tom, how you doing?
For having us.
So, very briefly, what's a pico balloon?
Well, a pico balloon basically is just pretty much a small party balloon. They're very small, maybe 2 foot, 3 foot in circumference. Nothing real special.
And what is the purpose of it? It's not like for someone's birthday, right? What do you do with a pico balloon?
Well, ham radio operators, of course, are licensed, and we have a background of many years of experimenting and doing scientific research and things. And this is just an area that we're involved in. We test radio propagation, signal strength, decoding, and things like that. So it's a neat way to get a signal off at a distance from you. And these little pico balloons are they're about 32 inches in diameter, and actually the payload that I fly is about 1.7 grams.
Now I understand that you think you know who sent up the one of these pico balloons, and we think it's a pico balloon, right? That a F-22 Air Force jet shot down.
I do. We have public tracking sites on the internet, web pages that have Google Maps, and you can actually see these balloons as they move across the Earth. You can see their position, you can see their altitude, you can see all these things. So it's on multiple websites, and we knew right where that pico balloon was, and then
so
we knew.
So who sent it up, Tom?
Who sent it up?
Yeah, the one that was shot down.
It was some ham group up in Wisconsin that sent this one up that got shot down.
Now, are these adult students? I mean, do we know anything about them?
Yeah, it's a small group of a few adults and a lot of youth, ages from 12 years old and up, and they actually put this thing together, built the solar panels and soldered them together and glued them together and took this thing outside and launched it.
You know, one of the things that has been brought up by the Pentagon is that these things are being shot down because they were at an altitude that could be a threat to air safety. And I understand that most of these balloons are flying above where civilian aircraft would be, but they do have to go up to that altitude, and some of them come down from that altitude. So is there some validity to that concern?
Not really. I think that's the only excuse they have right now for taking these things down. We fly under FAA 101 exemption. That's an FAA rule. If you look at those, there's certain criteria that we need to meet. If we meet that criteria, we don't have to file any kind of flight plans or anything. I've got a commercial pilot friend, 35 years just retired, wide body. He's never seen a balloon in the air.
So Tom,
it's a big place up there. It's a big place. It's like taking a cork. It's like taking a cork and throwing it in the ocean. Would a boat ever hit it?
So Tom, tell me, how many balloons are floating out there in this universe then?
Well, you know, it's hard to say. Of course, we track our balloons, but I imagine these Pico balloons that are being tracked now, there could be upwards of 60 or 70 of them, because hams in all other countries around the world launch these things, and they traverse the world. Hey, and you think of this, this is no more. In fact, a few years ago, the only balloon that we had that we could fly was these Mylar party balloons. And if you think that's what the kids get for their birthday, there's about 1 million birthdays per year. If 10% of those are kids and they go outside and they turn the balloon loose, what is that? That's 100,000 balloons in the air in one day, isn't it?
So, Tom, roughly what does one Pico balloon cost? Roughly.
Well, we build our own equipment, so we've got it down very cheap. The flights that I'm flying, we probably got about $45-50 in them.
$50.
Yeah.
So I want to get this straight. So a United States Air Force F-22 worth millions and millions of dollars fired a missile worth millions and millions of dollars to shoot down a basically $50 balloon?
Yeah. Actually, the balloon's $12.
$12.
Yeah.
It's getting worse.
Yeah.
All right,
and, a Sidewinder missile, it only cost about $399,000.
Oh, it's a regular bargain. Tom Medlin, retired FedEx engineer, we're talking about the balloons that are bursting.
That talks about budgets and really forces members of Congress and the White House to do the math and to show their work. Has projected some things that should have us all a little bit concerned and change the conversation. And Brian, you had a great, not just a tweet storm, but a chart storm, because you always got the visuals there to help us break it all down. But give us a sense. What is it that the CBO is saying? Here we have a baseline budget for the first time in a long time. What is it telling us?
That the bill is coming due, not only for Social Security and Medicare, but for all the legislation we've had passed, all the expensive bailout bills, all the $1 trillion omnibus bills. The bill is coming now. The Congressional Budget Office projects that the baseline budget deficit will jump to nearly $3 trillion a year in a decade. Now, you'll remember that before the pandemic, the deficit was about $700 or $800 billion. And the pandemic spiked it, but that was temporary for the pandemic. But we're going from what had been $700 or $800 billion to $3 trillion. And that's the rosy scenario. That assumes the 2017 tax cuts expire. It assumes no wars, no recessions, no new spending programs, and low interest rates on the debt. So the rosiest scenario is $3 trillion in deficits. Overall, over 10 years, the CBO projects we're going to add $20 trillion to the national debt. So the national debt's about $30 trillion right now. We're going to add $20 trillion just in the next 10 years.
Wow. And I want to go back. You ran through something in terms of the rosy scenarios that I just think we need to pause and just so you're saying this projection, which adding that much to the debt over the next decade is scary in and of itself. But you said that was assuming no wars, good peace, prosperity, low interest rates, the tax cuts expire, and then the world is nice and rosy. I don't know if any of those are on the docket as we look forward.
This is as good as it gets. Usually the Congressional Budget Office doesn't predict what Congress is going to do. They give them the baseline of, if you do nothing else, here's what it's going to look like. And then Congress builds on top of that. And having seen Congress like I do, that they always add more spending, they cut more taxes, you're going to have a recession here, there might be a little military skirmish there. And what's most scary is they assume that interest rates stay low.
Yeah.
And when you're pushing the national debt to $50 trillion, it doesn't take much of an interest rate increase to kill your annual payment on that.
Yeah.
Each point that interest rates rise is going to cost $2.5 trillion over the decade in higher interest costs. So, yeah, these scary numbers are as good as it gets.
Yikes. Okay, so let's hit a couple of drill down points. Well, I want to come back to Social Security and Medicare because that's becoming just the scare tactic conversation. So I'll come back to that in a second. But I want to start with something that you have pointed out a number of times and I think is so important. You talked about tax revenue and that they're really not the near-term problem. Break that down for us.
Yeah, I mean, tax revenues are $1 trillion higher than they were before the pandemic. And that's after adjusting for inflation. So it's not just a matter of, well, of course revenues are higher, it's inflation. Revenues have jumped $1 trillion a year above where we were, or $1 trillion per year above where we were during the pandemic. They're $1 trillion higher now. As a percentage of the economy, this past year we had the highest income tax burden in American history as a share of the economy, and the second highest overall tax burden in history. The result is revenues are way above average, and they're going to stay above average as a share of the economy. Revenues aren't the problem. There is no revenue decline. We're collecting a bigger share of national income than we have than almost any point in history. Why do we have deficits going to $3 trillion? Because spending is going to its highest level in American history outside of the peaks of World War II and the pandemic.
Wow. And so that's such an important thing because we always say, oh, we just need to tax more. We're bringing in more tax revenue than almost at any point in history, both in terms of just number and percentage.
Yep.
So now let's get to the issue that really has become the fake fight and the false choice, in my opinion, and that is Social Security and Medicare. And
Yep.
we know that they're going up at a crazy rate, an unsustainable rate. And so we do have to have a conversation about it. It's not a let's push grandma and grandpa off the cliff conversation, but it's if we do nothing, then we're really going to hurt grandma and grandpa, especially grandma and grandpa who may be poor or most vulnerable. They're going to get hurt the most in all of this. So where does a rational, reasonable conversation about Social Security and Medicare begin?
Probably not in Washington.
It begins on this show, Brian. We're going to start it right here, right now. You're on.
President Biden already said during the State of the Union that there will never be any changes to Social Security and Medicare. He also said no tax hikes for anyone earning under $400,000. That's impossible because if you don't fix Social Security and Medicare, you have to double middle-class taxes to pay for it. Taxing the rich, cutting defense, cutting welfare, cutting foreign aid ain't going to do it. But Washington doesn't want to talk about this because of the pandering. And so, I don't know how we get the country back on track on this. My fear is that you're going to need a debt crisis to get people to focus on the deficit and Social Security and Medicare driving the deficit because as a country, we just can't get our act together to focus on this stuff until we have an external problem drive us into a fiscal crisis, and then we'll talk about it. I'm actually pretty cynical right now because the worse the deficit gets, the more politicians adamantly say we will not fix this.
Yeah, and that is the issue. And both sides are saying, look, we're not going to have this conversation about it. Is there, as we march obviously towards the need to raise the debt ceiling, which we know now is going to be somewhere around July, and all of this talk of extraordinary, super extraordinary measures. We keep redefining all the terms like, super core index we have now, which takes out everything that impacts inflation. So there is no inflation. We should feel better about that today. But are we marching towards this July showdown? Is there, I keep saying it's not a real panic button because something's just going to happen in the end. But will something happen in the end that will actually start any of these conversations that we've been talking about?
So I think something will happen that raises the debt limit, although I get a little nervous when members of Congress are so confident that something will happen that they don't actually make something happen.
Right. Because they can talk about it.
It's going to happen because we're counting on them to make it happen. Ultimately, I think we will raise the debt limit because we always have before, even if we scare ourselves in the process. But the danger is I'm less and less confident that this is actually going to bring a real day of reckoning with our fiscal numbers. You know, we used to agree on this in the 80s and 90s. We'd raise the debt limit and almost always attach reforms. And we ended up with a balanced budget in 98. And now that's just not where lawmakers are. So I think we'll raise the debt limit, but if you were hoping that it would actually cost, a day of reckoning, I don't see it happening.
Yeah, I agree, sadly. And this is one of those that, again, I don't think it's going to start inside of Washington. As you pointed out, Brian, it's going to be up to we the people to make it very clear that the time is now, that we can't wait until the crisis, because that ends up hurting those most vulnerable the most in the end. Great insight, great analysis. Everyone, you should check out Brian's tweet storm and chart storm, which gives you a real great visual in terms of where we are. Brian, I know this is a super busy day for you. Always appreciate your perspective. Brian Riedel is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and one of the best minds when it comes to dollars and cents and where we are as a country in the country. Thanks for joining us, Brian.
Thank you so much.
So important as we look at these numbers. And I know the numbers are head spinning. I know they're staggering. I know we have $30 trillion in debt. We're on our way to $50 trillion. We have annual deficits that continue to pile up. We have things to deal with. We have challenges all the way around. But here's what we have to think again about, beyond all the headline stuff, beyond the politics of it. And that is, when the president says he won't negotiate, and when Republicans say they won't yield, what they're really saying is we refuse to put the American people first, and we refuse to solve the American people's problem because it gets in the way of their politics. We have to have this discussion. We have to have the discussion about Medicare. We have to have a discussion about Social Security. We have to have a conversation about taxes. We have to have a bigger conversation about spending, because we're actually bringing in more taxes than we ever have, and we're still over $1 trillion behind every single year and counting. Describe what is happening in terms of these proposed changes to the kind of the checks and balances within the democracy in Israel.
Yeah, so the new government under Netanyahu wants to push through judicial reforms that will basically render, the High Court of Israel toothless. There is also an intention to defund or pull the plug on the public broadcasting network named Khan. And Israelis feel very alarmed about both of these measures. I mean, because to many Israelis, it looks like steps towards, kind of dictatorship, that there will be no free media, that the judicial system will not be able to police other, parts of the government, as you will. So there's a lot of alarm about these measures.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting. I know that part of that reform would enable the Knesset, the parliament, to overturn rulings by the judiciary, which has to be alarming to everybody. And then you also have just this very fascinating alliance between Prime Minister Netanyahu and all of these factions. And that's when I think that's hard for Americans to understand. We're used to this two-party thing. In Israel, you've got many, many parties, and you have to get a coalition governing body to actually be in charge. And so describe kind of how that's playing out. And then some of the things that you did in your reporting in your Political magazine piece in terms of what is the conversation in the streets for the Israeli people?
Yeah, I do want to say one thing about the Knesset and the judicial reforms. There is a lot of alarm about what's happening, and rightfully so. But I also think that we need to think a little bit about the bigger picture here. I wrote an article over 10 years ago about numerous high court rulings that the Israeli government was ignoring. And this is a long-standing issue with the Israeli government, that it disregards the rulings of its own high court. And in fact, in the past, there have been critics who have called the High Court a fig leaf, because it kind of gives Israel the impression of being a democracy with a system of checks and balances. But already that system of checks and balances wasn't functioning entirely as it should, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, as far as building a coalition, Netanyahu has to kind of keep – I don't want to let him off the hook and say like he's this amazing guy who, cares deeply about democracy. But at the same time, he also has to, work with the members of his coalition and keep them happy. So, this is a difficult thing. And that's why we've seen, Israelis go to elections so many times in the past few years because these coalitions are not working out.
Yeah. And so as you get to the people level and then looking kind of more broadly, how this is impacting foreign investment in the country, the relationship with the U.S., what are some of the things that you're sensing and seeing there? Yeah,
so there's a lot of concern that this will make a big impact on Israel economically as foreign countries kind of pull away from partnerships, that involve investing in Israel. There's also concern that, if Israel loses the support of the U.S., that it'll be kind of left to its own devices from a security standpoint. And so if, Israel continues on this path and the alliance with the United States comes into question, there's alarm that Israel could be vulnerable in a way that it has not been in the past. So, but, when you're on the street with protesters, their biggest concern is not so much the relationship with the U.S., but, what's happening with their own country internally. But then if you start to kind of dig around a bit, there's concern about the relationship with the U.S., but it comes from a place of like, why won't the U.S. step in and help us? Why won't the U.S. intervene? There's a feeling that Israel, answers to the U.S., and I think that's accurate in many ways, and that, the U.S. has the ability to hold Israel accountable for what's happening and to kind of demand for things to take a different path.
Yeah, and that's been one that we've been trying to get a good sense on in terms of, will President Biden really send the message to Prime Minister Netanyahu and say, look, this stuff isn't going to fly, or this is going to impact where we are in our alliance and relationship with you. Anything that you're hearing in terms of that relationship with the U.S. and anything that the U.S. is doing to put some pressure to say, hey, let's be very careful where we're treading.
Yeah, so I spoke with Aaron David Miller, who, knows way more about this stuff than I do. And he doesn't think that there's the U.S. is going to really put a lot of pressure on Israel, at least not publicly. So if Israelis are, looking to the U.S. to help, they're looking in a misguided way. It's probably not going to happen. We also have to think a little bit about, American interest in the Middle East. Who else would they, ally themselves with or ally ourselves with there besides Israel? Lebanon is in shambles, for example, and is also home to Hezbollah. Egypt, we give loads of money to Egypt already, but I don't think that we're just going to jump ship on our, long-standing special relationship with Israel and throw our lot in with, say, Egypt or Lebanon. It seems like it's, kind of a partnership that's cemented in many ways. And I think that, some of my interviewees expressed concern that this could actually be damaging to Israel, that this unconditional support, is then enabling Israel to do things that endanger its own future.
Yeah, so important. Great insight. Such a complicated area of the world, and these alliances and allies are so important to the United States, and these relationships matter. Maya Jarrett, of course, just always great to have you on the show. Great piece in Politico magazine, and we look forward to having you back again soon.